Так, коллеги, мы переходим ко второй сессии нашего форума.
Dear colleagues, we're now passing to the second session of this seminar. And Lena will now introduce our expert from Sweden. Dear friends, it is difficult for me to introduce the expert of this session because me personally and the school on the whole are so full of friendship and gratitude to Mr. Sohlman that it is difficult to talk about him. He is a member of the Swedish Royal Academy. As his grandfather, he was the executive director of the Nobel Committee, and Alfred Nobel himself entrusted his grandfather with the duty and the responsibility to disseminate this idea of Nobel philosophy. And indeed, it happened so that trust was inherited, was taken down to the grandson. And Jeffrey published his book on trust, so trust going through generations. Sweden is a country. It is not a country of sterility, but it is a country of outstanding honesty. Many of you might have been in Sweden, and you must go and you must visit Sweden. But two things that have become truly efficient. First of all, they have found their place in the world as a normal nation. It is very important to be or to feel oneself a normal. And secondly, they are as honest as one can imagine, because honesty was instituted as a guardian of norm in Sweden, and these 9 million people in the technological and civil sense, they live and they keep their spirits and their place in the world very high. They meet the challenges of the modernity with flying colors. We are proud to be a partner in the civic initiatives, and it is a great privilege to the school to Sweden has been a financial and intellectual contributor to the Moscow School for many years, and Mr. Sohlman is one of our experts and members of the board. Mr. Zakharov would like to add something. Just an ionic remark. Let me draw your attention to the fact that Sweden became a normal country in many ways thanks to Ukraine, because after the Swedish king lost the Battle of Poltava, and look at the historical paradox. Mr. Zakharov, you have said it for the entire country, but this is true. But it is always good to tell the truth. Let me also say, I have known him and his family, his daughter, and it is a part of my life. My friendship with Mikhail Sohlman is a part of my life and a part of life of my husband. And this great energy, pedantry, and care with which he participates in the work of the advisory board of the school helps us to keep our spirits up. We have annual seminars in Sweden. Our partner there is the Stockholm School of Economics, and while we conduct an annual seminar devoted to the civil society in Sweden and the central role of the civil society in a state based on the rule of law. But today we will talk about economics. Thank you, Lena. Thank you for this kind introduction. My personal thanks to you and to the school for inviting me to your seminars, which to me are a great privilege. Talking to you, being here, attending your seminar, working in the spirit of the school and in the spirit of Peter the Great, casting this window on Europe and opening it wider and wider is always a great honor. It is always good to try and analyze the successes and the failures of one's neighbors. Well, I can see that you are very, very surprised by Mr. Sohlman's Russian. Well, his mother, coming from a very noble Russian family, of course had Russian as a mother tongue, but Mr. Sohlman learned his Russian while in Moscow, and his father was a Swedish ambassador, and so he studied in the Moscow school when he was a child. I have prepared such a menu of this session. First of all, to clarify some of the important perspectives of the world economy, and also to expand and talk about the euro stagnation and the development of the eurozone. Thirdly, as to how we can talk about the long-standing perspectives of the world economy in the OECD in Paris, and if we have a bit more time, we can talk about some urgent matters which are being discussed in the Western societies of today. Let me start by the gross national product, the GDP, a notion that everybody uses, and there can be a lot of critique of this concept, because there's a lot which is not entered into the index of the GDP, and one may argue as to how effective it might be, such as the extraneous effects of both negative and positive nature, the reserves of the ecology, the costs, the environmental costs, and this critique of the GDP has led to a situation where, when other indexes are developed, such as the Human Development Index, one of these, which takes into account the GDP per capita, but it is done also in comparison with the longevity and the educational landscape, and then of course the disposition changes considerably. The United States become where the longevity is lower than in other countries, gets lower in this list, and the Scandinavian countries which have a higher longevity, they go up in this list. So it's the Human Development Index, a more compound classification. The graph behind me shows the weight, specific weight of different regions in the world. This comes from the you are here graph that comes from the International Monetary Foundation, and here you can see how the specific weight of the United States goes down, but the forecast included for 2019 shows that this level of the United States may go down to 22, but no lower. At the same time, the green curve here shows the growing specific weight of Asia, primarily China, but also other dynamically developing Asian powers. Here, China is shown represented in the blue line, and the violet line here is the Eurozone. Not all of the European Union, mind you, because only 18 countries of the European Union are part of the Eurozone, versus 28 member states of the European Union, and such important countries as Great Britain, Poland, Sweden are not part of the Eurozone, so that has to be taken into account. And Norway is also not a part of Eurozone. So these dependencies were constructed last year. For the more recent data, the forecasts have been lowered. So this year, the growth of the world economy is shown on the level of 3%, with things lightening up a little bit next year, and in 2006 up to 4.9%. Such analysts say that the financial risks have decreased, and this in turn is explained by the consolidation of the Eurozone in the financial sense, and the increase in the developing countries, which have indeed suffered from the predicted stiffening of the monetary policies in the US, and the capital started to leave the developing countries for America, because America started to be more to show more positive perspectives for the return on the investment. But this has now gotten more placid, and the policies of the federal system against the background of the growing American economy shows that the bonds are bought less, the so-called quantity of leasing or the quantity of easing is showing the second negative derivative. If you look at these zones, then for countries members of the OECD, the growth for 2.5% is envisaged, with the United States having about 0.25% and Eurozone 1%. At the same time, the developing countries are expected to have about 4 to 5%, China, which had a lot of concerns about the financial stability because of its not very transparent financial system, and it is subsidized and it's under the control of the authorities. So the stability of the Chinese banks was feared. However, caused anxiety. But this wave of discontent has now abated, and it is envisaged that there will be a lower growth, not up to 10 to 12% per annum, but about 7%, which is still quite good in comparison with the general picture. In the zone of the OECD countries, we can see a growing gap between the supply and demand, and this is shown as the high unemployment rate in many countries. The inflation, and we can get back to this, the inflation which is so much feared by the central banks, does not get up to 2%. But now there are even fears that deflation might ensue, whereby there's a negative dynamics of prices. So this is the general picture for the close future. We may get back to the question on the uncertainty of the military and political situation in Ukraine, but this is a separate question. Let me now pass on to the so-called euro stagnation. The point is that irrespective of whether we like it, 35% of Russian export goes to the European Union. This is an asymmetrical situation because the export from EU into the Russian Federation is much lower in terms of the share of the global exports. I think that Germany, which is one of the major exporters, has about 8% of its export going to Russia, Finland about 12%, and of course many services, because there are many Russian tourists or visitors going to Finland. But in Sweden, only 1.5% of our export is oriented towards Russia, even though we have quite advanced position in terms of capital investments to Russia. On the way here, you might have seen two big industrial bases not far from the turn from the highway into Golitsyno, which is the Scania and Volvo motor car manufacturers. The European monetary story is such that the general euro concept was developed very early, but it was only a matter of the agenda for the future until the unification of Germany. And at that time, François Mitterrand demanded for France to enter or to accede to the unification of Germany for the currency affairs to develop. I think here we can see the instinct of the French president harkening back to 1817, 1914, and 1940. And at that time, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the dominating the national bank was the Bundesbank, which installed the percentage in the interest rates, and this indeed set the course for many other national banks in Europe. And to the French, this was unacceptable. because the Germans were thought to be regulating the major economic factors in France. So the French believed that through unification of the banks and the currency become common, France would have more leverage. Indeed, the great irony of history is that if anything has come out of this story is that Germany became even stronger and now truly sets the standard for the weaker countries in Europe and even for France. So indeed, they wanted to make it better, and it happened as it always does, according to the proverbial phrase of the Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin. So this is not a solid construction. This is not a optimal currency zone, because there have to be three requirements that need to be satisfied. On the example of the United States, for such a zone to be effective, there have to be fiscal stabilization mechanisms, automatic. If one region goes through recession or a downturn, then this region must pay less taxes, and the center must pay more. This is what happens in the United States. Let us say if in Massachusetts something happens to one of the taxpayers, then the next day Massachusetts pays less taxes to the federal government, and there are more money flowing into Massachusetts from the federal government. The second requirement is that the setting of prices and salaries must be more flexible, and in the same way there has to be a willingness to move from one region to another, which is of course much facilitated by the fact that the United States is a country of one language, even in spite of the great role played by the Spanish language. So what we see is the great social mobility of the Americans coming from the east to west, or vice versa, is indeed showing that the Anglo-Saxons have said that this is not, these requirements are not satisfied in Europe, and the Brits were told that you are Angles, you're Anglo-Saxons, you don't understand what happens in continental Europe. So this is an argument ad personam, or is it an argument ad causa? Is it an essential argument? So these American and British economists, unfortunately for the Eurozone, came out to be right, because the main statement was that within the monetary union in Europe there was supposed to have a convergence, and the conditions in the different regions would be such that they would be leveled, and the general competitiveness would rise in the south of Europe, thanks to the capital expenditures, the investments which flow or were supposed to flow from north to south. And this was indeed the piece of rhetoric, or even when the numbers started to show towards the end of the first decade of Euros zone, is that apparently it's not about convergence but the relative unit labor cost, as juxtaposed with the cost of the unit of labor. Later on, in addition to these factors, we saw how many of the agreements stopped to be observed, and the debts that were not to exceed 60% turned out to be untrue as a statement, because Germany had to spend more, or France, and then such criteria started to be treated with great laxity. Yet another no-bail law for the system not to extend loans to specific countries if this deficit increases a certain level. And the last point is that in the basis of the European Central Bank is not to finance the state expenditures, which is currently being done through an indirect means, buying bonds in the market. One may look at the proof of the pudding. Of course, the proof of the pudding is the eating of it, and you only check the quality of the pudding when you eat it. And one may, let me try to set it going. Some of you may see here that these graphs describe the development of the GDP from the beginning of the euro system, from the launching of euro, and the orange graph is the eurozone. Two other graphs are the United States, which is the white graph, and a piece of Swedish nationalism, which is the Swedish line or graph. So the Brussels ideologues were saying that in the first 10 years Europe must become the most competitive party in the world, which is in a way a diplomatic reformulation of Mr. Khrushchev's dogmas about passing the United States in the economic development. And of course, it is not just about the Eurozone, but a whole number of weaknesses, of the immanent weaknesses of the European Union, the demographic problems, the problems with the capital investments, and so on. But what is interesting, it is interesting to consider in greater detail this graph here. Here it is. This is the graph covering the period from 2006 up until now, and thus embraces the period of the financial crisis. You can see that all three zones sagged in their GDPs, and then they have a kind of a comeback thanks to budget interventions by many national governments. The United States climb back, and if you start from this beginning of the crisis times, the U.S. grew by 11%. The Eurozone, in contrary, only climbed back by 3%, and it is seen that the Swedish system, which made a resolute 12% comeback.
It can be explained by structural weaknesses and the policy conducted. The southern countries, which are weak, with poor budgets, had to cut down their expenses for good things like social welfare, healthcare. They had to change their labor conditions. All this brought down the demand, As to the big countries, after the active policy of 2008 or 9, countries like Germany and Great Britain, they were very rigorous about their budget policy, and they achieved the expected results. Hence, social and political consequences, like growth of extremism, even in Greece, it's Nazi party which is quite successful. In Hungary, also there are fascist groups moved forward. In France, the National Front and Le Pen and his daughter now were quite successful. There are many different factors, like general economic situation and the problems of migration. So this policy created a favorable ground for these unpleasant plans. German economist said that this was Brüning, number two. Brüning conducted this kind of policy in the 20s and the 30s in Germany to support the cost of money, or rather restore the cost of money. And for this high level of unemployment was made, and we know only too well who gained political dividends under the circumstances. Some people say that the Union, EU, would fall down, Greece would go out, or some other southern countries, and they would be able to restore their competitive edge through their own currency, which is free. But of course this was difficult politically, and now we observe the continuation of stagnation, or at least relative stagnation. Forecasts mention potential growth of economy in the Eurozone up to 1%, 1.5. And this process of internal devaluation, implying reduced demand and increased unemployment, and it presses upon salaries and prices, and in this way you increase competitive edge at the internal and external markets. But this is a lengthy process. But during this process, you also reduce capital investments, not only into physical things, but into human capital as well. Which potentially is ripe with bad things for the future. To restore the trend would be very difficult, because there was a serious fall, and now to restore it will be difficult. But elites are sure that the road is correct. Germany thinks so. Well, probably a German taxpayer should be restricted even more, should be levied even more. The banking union is not ready to restore a solid system for banks, because what is required is that all the countries are ready to take a check from those who are incapable of paying for their own banks. In Sweden, our Prime Minister said that we need a referendum. As a matter of fact, in Reichstag, they were sure that Sweden should join the Euro zone. And there was a referendum, and this was the victory of democracy. Elite and all parties and business and trade unions wanted wanted people to vote in favor. Usually the results may be 52, 48, and in this particular case 42 were in favor and 56 or 58 were against. This was a clear signal from the people to the elite, meaning that we are not sure. If we see that it is really necessary, we may join the Eurozone later. In Scandinavia, we have 4 different currencies. Finland, it has Euro. Denmark, they have their own krone, but their monetary policy is in line with the European Central Bank. Norway have their own krone, and we have our own in Sweden. No complaints, no problems. Forest industry is unhappy from time to time. In 2009, when the krone fell down, and they were quite competitive comparing with the Finnish colleagues, but now our krone is up. Now our people are not happy. But this is about just one industry. Otherwise, Scandinavia is the most dynamic zone in the Western Europe, economically speaking. So euro is actually a structure without foundation. And I recall what John Major said, who was a prime minister at that time. He wrote an article in Economist, and this was considered to be a scandalous article. He said that this project may be considered with dancing to get rain. Some tribes do it, expecting rain to come in time of drought. But after these experiments, it seems that there was some part of the truth in what he said. Now, long-term prospects based on recent OSCE reports, they look up to 2060 in their magnifying glass for 50 years, according to their forecasts. Annual growth of the world economy would go down from 3.6 within the first decade up to 2.4. And there are two main factors. We are growing older, meaning demography is not favorable. We have a prominent professor of medical demography, and I always promote his site, Gapminder. It's enormous treasury of articles on different perspectives, year by year. You may find there the number of people for each number of children for each woman and the corresponding economic growth. If you are interested, go there to this site, and you'll see how GDP in Russia grew up comparing with other countries. It's Gapminder. And there is a special foundation by Bill Gates to use this statistical instrument. So they say that the number of children in families goes down with the increase of GDP per capita. And today we have 7 billion people, and according to this calculation, the population will reach 9 billion people, and this figure would remain stable. Of course, we all grow older, and developing countries which develop from a low start, so to speak, but they move quickly. Although this movement goes down, when they reach the level of lifespan which is close to the developed countries. Innovations and education play a more important role for development of individual countries. Balance between developed and developing countries is changing, and these curves show the trend. And in 2060, GDP per capita in China will be at the same level that in America nowadays. In India, it will be 50%. It will reach 50% of the American level. Inequality grows up between different categories of people in this country, and between countries in general there's a certain balancing of economic situation. So the question is, what is to be done? And they have several recipes. A reform of the labor markets to make them more mobile, stable rights for intellectual property, like patenting and so on, different methods for increased productivity and increased share of employee in the economy. In many countries, employee is still low comparing with the potential capacities. In Scandinavian countries, the employee is pretty high. And we can talk in our country about the role of women in the labor market. A redistribution of revenues is very important. Some people think that we have to redistribute fortunes because the difference between different strata of population grows up in America and in Western Europe, especially. You have to invest into education, and international cooperation is of paramount importance. You have to liberalize trade. You have to introduce integration into labor chains. You have to use achievement of science. And there is a very big issue of protecting ecology, environment, because we have climatic dangers. So on the one hand, you have to increase GDP, but at the same time, you should not forget about the environment. So that's where I put an end, because I'm mostly interested in your questions. We still have 45 minutes for a Q&A. Welcome. Андрей Бережной, минеральные воды. My question. Against the background of good indicators in the European Union, we still have high level of unemployment, 11% in the European Union. What instruments are to be used to reduce the level of unemployment? Probably you may cite some examples on the Swedish background. I'm sure that other colleagues may present their own answers, and Mr. Skidelsky, for instance, who is very active in international discussions about what is to be done. There are conservative groupings and post-Keynesian groups. It seems to me that the European infrastructure requires serious capital investments, but people are afraid to do it because it may increase deficiency, especially in the southern countries. Italian Prime Minister wants to be lenient in this field, but it's rather an ideological fight, whether you explain employment because people don't want to do, or they are uneducated, or demand is poor in the economy in general. When a problem arises, you cannot explain it with one factor. But, well, I think that we have a poor demand. The level of public investments goes down. And then, well, to rectify it, you have to improve capital investments. To create environment for private investments too. And if there is no demand at the market, the people would not invest. You may, it can be done in some other economy where there is a political management which instructs people what to do, like in China. And the same is true about this country. But in the Western Europe, you need to increase demand. In Sweden, we somehow were saved in time of this crisis. But, of course, it's bad that the growth in the European Union in general is very poor. So, well, we think that we need to invest more into infrastructural things. And you have to be active in improvement of competence of workers. So if they are engaged in a branch of industry which is not promising, to some other branch. Spanish engineers go to Germany now, and they are on demand there, but not in Spain. Anton, welcome. Anton Khvastov from Saratov. Several months ago, I wrote a critical article on Sweden. It was said that Swedish socialism is a myth. You have no technologies, innovations, and you remained in the 80s of the last century. What can you say about this myth? In the 50s, in America, they wrote articles about Sweden being the country of immoral standards, country of lust, and so on. Now, they also say that we have a lot of pedophilia. We don't have this kind of information as to more serious issues. If the author of this article saw the ratings, international ratings, on the level of innovations and level of favorable conditions for entrepreneurship, level of capital investment into science and research, actually in all these items we are at the front. Well, probably we are at the top. Our high-tech expert is, to say the least, satisfactory. So it's not only IKEA, Tetra Pak, and Skype, and so on. But we convince the world that we have many interesting things in Sweden. Of course, we have our problems at each level. And economy is a dismal science, and it is problematic. But of course, you have to find more efficient solutions. And we have different problems. For instance, our tax problem is absurd. But politicians somehow do not want to make reforms in this area. Probably in the near future we'll somehow be able to adjust. So probably we'll have a coalition to make reforms of a tax system which Swedish economists consider rational. So I haven't read the article you mentioned. If you take a long period in Scandinavia and Sweden, Scandinavia or Sweden were widely criticized. We were an alternative to Great Britain, for instance. We have conducted many reforms, a Swedish model. Has certain variations up to 70, from 70 to 90, the years. Now we have a different period. So of course you should study realias in a more detailed way. Вадим Коровин Тамбов. The level of well-being of Russians within the last several years grew up, but there is a flip side. The labor force becomes more expensive. So what you pay for salaries is about 50% now, the enterprises, which is quite a negative signal, a pre-crisis signal. So if you can comment on this situation, on the conditions of the Russian economy. I'm not a Russian expert. You'll have reliable experts here, like Mikhail Zadornov. This economy is overheated, especially in the two capitals. I came from Sweden and took this Euro Express, and I go out at the Belaruski railway station, and I see the sandwich lady who offers the job to constructors, to builders. What does it really mean? It means the lack of labor force in the construction sector, and under such circumstances it's very difficult to hold negotiations between labor and capital. Labor is gainful, and which amounts to the increased salaries. As to competitive edge of Russia in the international field, the structure of your export is such that 75% of it is energy carriers and some specific machine building with the military edge.
Otherwise, there are few goods that depend or can impact labor cost on the product that they produce. So far, while the prices, oil and gas prices, remain like this, what they are today, things will continue this way. A totally different story is what regional effects it could have on how in this, is it 20 cities with a population over 1 million, let alone capitals, let alone small towns and villages across the country. This is where we see a very different story. But as to your question As to the fine details, I suppose Mikhail Zadornov would be the person to ask this question. Philip Korbut from St. Petersburg. The Swedish economic model has social focused, and about 10% of the subjects, if I'm wrong about the figures, please correct me, 10% of the subjects get welfare payments. There are generations who live on welfare payments. Is this a problem for the Swedish economy? Is it relevant at all? And how is the Minister of Finance going to address this problem if it is burning? Well, we were famous for being quite lavish in our system. The alliance that is in government today and has been in government since 2006, they've made it tougher, put more restrictions on qualifications for social welfare payments. And the policy right now is is tougher. And this is something that is being covered by the mass media. And probably they are sometimes going too harsh. And this is why they are seeing political struggle because of this issue. Again, another reason to qualify for unemployment benefits. They haven't changed the payments, but the inflation is certainly there, and real level has really quite gone down for some patients, for some citizens. But for that matter, we have a question, unless it's even a question about immigration. Sweden. Well, actually, there are a lot of questions about Sweden, but since you raised this question, I suppose I have to take it. Sweden, after the Second World War, received these waves of high-qualified people from the Baltics, from Finland, of labour force, and first and foremost, highly qualified labour. And they integrated quite smoothly, and there are no problems about their integration, moral, ethic, religious is the same as Lutheran Christians. And later, there was a time when we had labour shortage and saw import from Italy, then imported labour from Yugoslavia, from Turkey nowadays. And when there was demand on labour, especially, there were no particular problems on that. But that was still the late 1970s. But since 1980s, we're seeing more refugees. And recently, we are quite illiterate from Somalia, from with very different civilization background, and this is creating the moods and creating the background for anti-immigration feeling and sentiment across the country, and open racism. And in view of what we had, and we still have, what is typical of Sweden, that is high level of unemployment, about 7-8%. This is again reason for extremism, and a party of Swedish Democrats is working on it. In some countries they are quite democratic, these people, and want to more or less shut down immigration, and Sweden is now accepting many people. We took almost as many from Iraq, refugees from Iraq, as Germany. Now Syria is, we're now seeing high flow, and this is certainly about integrating these people into the Swedish labour market, into the Swedish culture. This is quite a challenge for the political system that is based upon freedom of individual to choose his or her views, religion, and so on. So for The political system, I suppose we need to work hard on this, even in a country, such country as Sweden. Sasha, please, you now have the floor. Chernov Alexander from Bryansk. Mr. Sohlman, can you comment as a president of Europe, not of the EU, this information? Recently, I've come across more and more often cases where Europe does not really depend upon Russia upon gas consumption. Only 24%. This is our share in European gas import. Spain, for example, gets it from Algeria, UK at all. Well, the only country that is more or less dependent, that is Central and Eastern Europe, where as much as 30%. Now, given all this battle in Ukraine, Europe says no to gas, certainly not overnight, but say during year 2 finds alternative sources of energy, and this will not really impact upon Europeans at all, and we will lose all our aces and all our best cards in this fight. Well, I do not really know about all the details, but it is clear that this question of dependence on energy supplies from Russia, and gas supply from Russia, that has been on the cards for quite a while. And this was raised quite a while ago. And given certain episodes where negotiations about the price for Ukraine and others would turn into a showdown and cold temperature sort of in the flats of some Europeans. But there's no such thing as united position or uniform approach, and it's quite obvious that what is now going on in Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, and what is going on right now, this has certainly made much stronger the positions of those who spoke for accelerated measures to create such a situation where you could choose other alternative sources of energy when needed. Everybody, I'm afraid, everybody, I think, is all for free trade, and if Russia would sell at acceptable prices, then it will sell, but we do not want to be dependent to the extent to which we see it right now. And it's hard for me to say. There are various positions about it, about shale gas, to which extent it can increase its, and whether we can increase its capacity for its output. Secondly, a strategic role is played by the United States of America, where in a very little time they turned from importer to exporter of energy. And there are limitations of export. They've introduced them back in the 1970s, when they saw an oil crisis, oil supply crisis in 1973, 1974. And they introduced a ban to export energy. But this is something like a dam that could be opened and shut down. And if they open it, then the prices on the energy market will be very different. But there are certainly forces that put a constraint upon it, because in the domestic market, American producers are very happy to get artificially low prices, well, compared to global prices on energy. This gives them a competitive edge in production. And there is a strong lobby that stands against this liberalization. Liberalization is all good for others, but for ourselves, price liberalization may turn out quite nasty, but there's certainly potential for this too. And the question about the openness of energy market in the EU, where we can see considerable weakening of the position of Gazprom to carry out different policies towards different markets in countries. Colleague who's sitting very far away from me. Anton from Krasnoyarsk, good day. Tell me, please, would it be correct to forecast economic growth points for the Eurozone too, and to link them to exploration of Arctic and given your graph, could it be a factor that correlates with the growth rate? This is my question number one. Question number two about the currency in these operations. Are the measures to support the economy, not of the United States, but of Euro, be it, say, the Russian Federation, could we probably substitute the currency in which payments are affected as countries pay for energy? Well, what about the Arctic? We forecast large, well, quite opening, remarkably, something that would open very soon, substantial resources on energy that if they're used even, if they hit our Earth, if they're to be used, then our planet would overheat even more. I do not see it happen in the very near future. I do not see it changing the position, say, in Italy, France, Spain or Norway. This is for sure. They have got the resources which they are known today. They are like, it's forecasted that they will run out of them at a certain time. But nowadays we see new resources opening up, and together with Russia they will see new opportunities opening, but the costs for exploring and for the output is quite substantial. I don't know what about the sanctions, what is being prepared now, but what I know of is that I've heard that among those main companies in the West, they are quite reverent about the Russian technology as to transport, as to pipes. They are effective and so on. But as to drilling capacity and technology, well, this is where Russia doesn't rank very high. And if some limitations and sanctions are put in place, this will certainly will stop, or at least will slow down these measures about Arctic exploration. Thank you, Anna Martinova from Krasnodar region. It's not a question that I want to ask, it's a remark to what you just pointed out about the dependence on the economic investment indicators and employment. Krasnodar region is one of the best faring regions economically in the Russian Federation, but the situation is like this. In Krasnodar region, the population is about 5 million people. 44 municipalities make up this region, and in each of these municipalities every year they implement at least one investment project in all kinds of spheres, be it processing industry and also agrarian and resorts. They are main economic growth points, and as a result the unemployment in my region as of now is at most 1.5%. Well, just look, which was like the case in Sweden, 1 to 2% unemployment rate. This is how we lived. This just stands to confirm what I've been discussing. I think if you host the Olympic Games, then your unemployment will disappear altogether. Well, you know, this question, certainly there are some communities that from time to time raise this question, but we naturally, they do not mean about the Summer Olympics, they're referring to Winter Olympics, because our climate seems to be, but luckily, as I think, they are still in the minority and they haven't yet had any success. Such experience says that there is no correlation between the venue for hosting the Olympics and whether it is winter or summer Olympics. It doesn't seem to matter at all. Good day, Albert Karimov from Yamal-Nemetsky Autonomous District. Well, I want to ask you this question. as to the executive director of the Nobel Prize Fund. It's just like President Obama was awarded a Nobel Prize and Nobel Peace Prize. And what's your opinion when they were saying they were giving it sort of in advance? And did he live up to the expectations that were put on him? And when they wanted to award him the Nobel Peace Prize, was the committee, were they unanimous? What do you mean when you continue saying like? Is it like Obama, like peace, like awarded? Well, I have resigned. It's been 3 years that I resigned from the executive position, but this question gives me a chance to once again try to explain how the Nobel Prize is awarded. The thing is that Lena even mentioned once that I was in charge of I was the chief of the Nobel Prize committee. The thing is there are 5 committees, yet another one on economy. So named after or in commemoration of Nobel. There are 6 different prizes. The fund stands alone. It's the capital. The fund, how shall I put it, oversees the compliance with the rules as the committees proceed with their work, pays for their work, but has no direct impact on how the committees work. As a member of the board of the Nobel Fund, before I was elected the member of Academy, I had no idea whatsoever who is the candidate, how they're awarding. It's all actually secret, and it's secret for 50 years. Nowadays, I can see through the Academy. I can see what is going on in the physics committee, in the chemistry committee, and in the economy committee, rather committee. So Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, is something that is being processed by the committee, Nobel Prize Committee, that is based in Oslo, and they're quite independent in their activities. As you understand, I am not an expert in physics or chemistry or economics. As an executive director, I could never have my own say on this, but I'm certainly human, and I can hear people and see things happening, but as a matter of principle, I've never, ever voiced anything on this regard. A totally different story is that these prizes, they appealed to different kind of target audience. Mostly physics committee deals with physicists, as the economics, well, I think I do understand something or another, but they work independently. But the thing is that in physics and in exact sciences, this is where you can control it. Whereas the Peace Prize, from the very start, it has been around and it still remains a political prize. And Norwegians put it this way. They say that the committee is made up of 5 Norwegians, but very much like other committees, this is the way they focus about this prize. It's not a certain amount, a certain sum. Nowadays the prize is much, bigger. But this network of cooperation in this area between the committee and international experts across the globe. And as they invite experts, engage experts from the globe, every year we speak about thousands. And as they're changing this list from year to year, so that to be like radio exploration of what would happen in this area further on. So I'm afraid, as to your question about President Obama, I have no judgment I could pass on this. I mean, something that I could voice in public. Well, dear colleagues, you now have the floor. Alexei Tupitsyn from Irkutsk region. Tell me, please, what are the prospects of cryptocurrencies? Cryptocurrency, bitcoins, how they can influence global economy. Well, sometimes I've read some newspaper articles, but I really cannot say anything good about this. It matters of control, who will use it and so on, but but I cannot say anything about its future. I forgot this question about the role of dollar and euro in our settlements. Yes, from time to time these initiatives arise to switch from dollar to some other currency. But as I understand it, nothing radical is being foreseen. No radical changes are foreseen to take place soon. Well, our colleague from Krasnodar, sitting next to Sasha, you now have the floor. Sergei Burtsev from Krasnodar. In your presentation, you mentioned intellectual property as one of economic growth factors. What I want to say is, do you think that the existing model of copyright and patent rights certainly stands in the way of new developments? Authors can, say, create software or write a song and then forever receive royalties for, say, 70 years. But if the case were that, say, copyright term could go down to 5 years, this will really promote further and more rapid developments. What's your take on this? And if you know something about the role of the Swedish Pirate Party, we would very much like you to share this. What do you mean, Pirate Party? Well, certainly it's a very important question. This is particularly relevant in medicine, where naturally these big pharma invest incredible amounts of money to identify new substances and create new drugs. And this is really huge money, and they want this money, they want return on this investment. It's purely for profit. And for this reason, they think that they need these lengthy exclusivity rights. But nowadays, if I'm not mistaken, it has been cut down like to 10 years, and then anybody may feel free, be it Czechs, India, or somewhere in China. They create what they call generics. As to 70-year, well, I suppose that counts only for fiction and for other. The main problem in Europe, I don't know, 30 if not 40 years, they've held negotiations about United European Patenting Office, and the French and the Spanish would disagree with the English approach. Nowadays, I suppose they nearly reached the solution to this matter, but which means that they're kept losing, because people used to patent in the United States and in Japan and in some European countries. Well, about this question, this is something that really touched upon me, about how sort of backward we are in Sweden. You can look up in the statistics of what they call triad patents, where they register patents in America, Japan, and in Europe. And this is where number one would be Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken, I mean per capita, and Japan ranks high. Sweden is ranking quite nicely, thank you, among those as compared to other countries, and on average about the EU. This is another indicator of how backward we are in our development. And the last question, dear colleague, you will be the last. Evgeny Konoplев, Moscow. A question to you as an economist. On the one side, we live in a very turbulent world nowadays, and the events like the 11th of September, 9/11, and reunification with the Crimea can change the political landscape radically. We can wake up in the morning to live in a world that is very different from what we remembered yesterday. Economists need long-term scenarios so that they could make forecasts and My question will be very direct. To which extent do you correlate the reliability of economic forecasting with the degree of global political turbulence? Critical events like this, do they altogether cancel the previous political forecasts, or can we take note of this but have something like backup plans and still have very much like outlines? A very much in-depth question, a very important question. The thing is that up until 2006, before we were hit by the financial crisis, we projected some growth trajectories, something that is well known, like labor force number, about the productivity of labor, about capital investment, their efficacy, and we could just draw some kind of pathways. And all of a sudden, but certainly we overlooked this Bank of International Settlements. This is where they warned us that this growth, it was based upon pumping up of financial bubbles, and this meant instability, but nobody could predict that the Americans would not save Lehman Brothers. Then they would bail out whom? Greece, Italy, but at that time there was a buyer, an English bank wanted to buy them, but this deal never fell through. We don't know what would have happened. But this is how that the curve, as you see, went down, as you see, and the economists, well, they just draw these probable possible pathways or lines, and each economist can then talk about the feasibility of this or other line that sort of projects development. And these institutions and think tanks that do it this way, that the most feasible would be that much % of this is how it works, and then there are other possibilities that would open, but they do not directly impact capital investment. And in companies, they take it into consideration, but they look at the market every minute. And it's clear that there's jihad of all 9/11. Where there was an attempt to several years before that they tried to explode these towers, but nobody thought it would happen the way it did. Even those vigilant people from CIA who were watching over local communities, saying some Arabs are learning how to fly the airplanes but are not very keen on landing. And they made no conclusions at all, even that they know it. So it's hard to project, especially it's hard to predict the future. That would be my take on this. It's a well-known quote. Dear colleagues, before I request that you should thank our expert, I would like to point out that Professor Jeffrey Hosking drew my attention that tomorrow in his morning session he will in fact show the consequences of those severe economic trends that were discussed by our distinguished expert for the civic society. We shall go deeper into this subject tomorrow, and in the same way I would like to underline that Mr. Sohlman has very warm feelings about this school, and this is something that we find as most important. I suppose there is something we need to thank our dear expert for. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's always a great pleasure for me. Enjoy your meal. We adjourn for 1 hour for lunch. Thank you.